Greetings and welcome to another edition of The Pedal Shift Project. The Pedal Shift Project is a series of conversations, thoughts, and experiments around the bike touring lifestyle. From tips and tricks to ideas on how to ride your ride, let's shrink the world by bike. Show notes and more are available at pedalshift.net/232, and you can email the show at pedalshift@pedalshift.net or text me at 202-930-1109 and check Pedal Shift out on all the socials as well. Hello everybody, happy February, and welcome to another edition of the Pedal Shift Project. My name is Tim Mooney, and we're really excited to talk about this edition. It feels like it's super newsy all of a sudden. In fact, one of the components to this episode literally came from an article in the Washington Post today, as I sit down and write, which never actually happens at all. Today, we're going to talk about something that has been happening, and it seems to happen a lot, and that is bicycle tour detours and closures, and how you can handle that type of thing when you are planning a ride and when you are perhaps even in the middle of a ride. And it's featuring a couple of situations that are popping up right now. Both routes have had detours and closures within recent years, some within actually less than a year. Now, the first one I want to talk about very briefly, and I'm going to talk about these two examples first, and then I'm going to get into kind of how you deal with all of that. The first is the C&O trail, obviously in my backyard, but something has happened recently that is really damaging, maybe is the right word, to a lot of people's plans and tours, and that is the cable ferry at a place called Whites Ferry. It's around mile marker 35. So it's 35 miles outside of Georgetown, outside of Washington, D.C. And it's the only non-bridge crossing of the river. And it goes back a couple hundred years. This is a historic thing. And there was essentially a ferry that was just pulled back and forth by a cable between the Virginia side and the Maryland side. Well, the folks on the Virginia side raised a big kerfuffle recently and said, hey, you haven't paid us, operator on the Maryland side, forever, and you're done. We're not letting you use this anymore. And they got the courts involved, and they are no longer operating, and they haven't been for a couple of weeks now. Now, during the winter, obviously that doesn't impact bike touring that much, but I know for a lot of you that you plan a bicycle tour, especially those of you who don't camp. There are hotels on the Leesburg, Virginia side of the river there, and they're relatively easy to get to. I wouldn't say that the road is super amenable to bicycling, but there's a big wide shoulder. You can get there, and a lot of folks plan a tour where you spend your final hotel night before DC or your first one out of DC in Leesburg, and you take advantage of that really, really cool cable ferry. Well, I've got a link in the show notes that's from today, as I sit here and record, that's saying it's not looking good. Both sides are really digging in. The Maryland folks, the operators of the ferry, they apparently offered several $100,000 for a licensing fee. The folks on the Virginia side said that's not enough, and both sides are really digging in. It doesn't look good. And I figured this was going to be a dollar sign thing. Apparently the operators of the ferry aren't willing to add $1 per ride to the ferry cost. They say that's not going to work, and it's a thing. Go read the article if you want to get more into the details on this. You figure a business transaction could happen, and there's pressure on all sides to get this done, but it's not happening, at least at this point. Okay, so let me throw that out there. The other thing that's newsworthy, it's happened in the last week or so, is that Highway 1, say it with me now, if you're used to hearing this, near Big Sur, again, a big mudslide after a massive amount of rain came down. I've got a link in the show notes to an LA Times article about all of that. Now, that one we're a little bit better off with. Now, we know it's closed. They've actually shrunk the section of the road of Highway 1 that's actually physically closed right now. It's probably going to get rebuilt in the spring, but if you had a spring tour idea, or if you just wanted to ride it in the near term, it's just not going to happen. Going back to the C&O, these issues come up all the time. Well, actually, I'll stick with Highway 1. This happens, it seems, every winter, or at least every other winter. And it's closed that road for long sections of time, because if you've ridden it before like I have, you know that frankly, the road is right on the cliffs. And if something goes wrong, it takes out the road. In fact, this particular outage, I took a look at it, and there was a picture in this LA Times article that I've got linked in the show notes, I recognize the trees. I have a picture, and I'll try to remember to put this in the show notes myself. I have a picture of myself and my Brompton in the trees that are within 100 yards or so of that outage. And it was really crazy. I guess it goes back to showing the thing that I talk about a lot, that, you recognize trees and guardrails a lot when you do these rides. I immediately recognized it, and it's kind of crazy. So hopefully they'll get that repaired. As I mentioned, though, these things happen a lot on these routes, and they happen on lots of different routes. Highway 1 gets washed out a lot. The C&O sometimes has issues outside of things like a business transaction in Whites Ferry. I'll recall from a few years ago the mile marker 52 washout. Big Slackwater often gets closed. And there's workable detours for those types of things. But other areas, I've had other experiences. The Ohio to Erie Trail near Akron, if you remember my ride a couple of years ago, they just said, up, trail closed, no detour listed. So this is common. This happens. And frankly, if you're not thinking about this as a possibility, I think that you're doing yourself a bit of a disservice. So when all is said and done, what is the best bet? How should you approach the concept of outages, closures, detours, things along those lines when you've got a bicycle tour? So I've got 5 points here, and then some kind of closing thoughts. So let's go through the 5 thoughts. They're not in any particular order, like all lists I do. I don't think they ever have a particular order. The first point that I would say in dealing with all of this is attitude. I don't think that routes are sacrosanct. They are subject to evolution. And I think that you shouldn't go into any tour with the feeling that it's ruined if you can't roll every single inch the way it's been done in the past. If you don't even have to go that far to find this to be the case. For instance, the Northern Tier route has changed. And indeed, many of the ACA routes have changed. I wouldn't be surprised if the old bicentennial route that existed back in 1976 that became the Trans Am, I wouldn't be surprised if that's changed quite a bit over the intervening 40 plus years. But, I think that just because it's been done before in a particular way doesn't mean it has to be done in the exact same way as before. I don't think that that's a way to look at any bike tour. You are riding your ride. And if you want to do the Pacific Coast tour, this spring, let's say, you may have to do something a little bit different. You may have to accommodate for the fact that you're not going to be able to roll through Big Sur. Now, maybe you'll be able to bike right up to Big Sur and figure out a shuttle around or do something along those lines. But your attitude needs to be, I am still riding the Pacific Coast route. I'm still riding the C&O route. I just may have to do things a little bit differently. It may not mean that you ride every single square inch of it, but the route as it exists when you ride it, that's what you're riding. You're not riding the route as it is when there aren't outages. You're riding it as it's confronting you in that moment. So have the right attitude when it comes to all of that. Second point here is your ride is an experience, and your ride is the experience that you're undertaking, and it's not the map. So I'm going to use an example. I'm not a big hiker, but I find a lot of wisdom from folks who hike the major trails of the United States, the Appalachian Trail in particular. They deal with this kind of stuff all the time, particularly the Continental Divide Trail and the Pacific Crest Trail. The route deviates from past years every single year. And they've got kind of rules within their ecosystem that says, you could take side trails and you can do things and you still have completed one of these Triple Crown trails. You're still hiking the AT. You're still hiking the Pacific Crest Trails because, especially for the ones out west, fires, floods, all sorts of things, they make what the trail is a dynamic thing. And I think that you should think about it that way for bicycle touring as well. There's a lot of wisdom in that. Again, if you were planning on cycling the C&O and, you are not able to ride Big Slackwater because there's flooding and they close it, just because you're doing the detour that the National Park Service has in place, that doesn't mean you missed out on the C&O. You did the C&O as it was available to you. The ride is the experience, not what the map says. If you're doing the Pacific Coast and you can't do Big Sur, that is a huge bummer. Don't get me wrong. It's a huge bummer. But what? It doesn't mean you didn't ride the full Pacific Coast Trail. If you did some kind of a workaround, you went down Highway 101 instead and went down through the central part of California for a little bit in there, that's not a problem. If you got a shuttle around it, that's not a problem either. Your ride is the experience. It's not what the map tells you. All right, point number 3. I think that this is a fork in the road, and I say to prepare or not to prepare, because this gets into different philosophies. I think I am on the record on this show that I'm a big prepper. I prepare way in advance for my rides. You have come along with me on that kind of a thing. Sometimes I actually go and drive some of the road routes. I'll hop on Google Earth, or I'll hop on Street View for Google Maps just to get a sense of what the ride is and what the road is there. Other folks, and I think that this is just as good of a way to do it, is they hop on a bike and their ride is what the road gives them. I think that is an equally awesome philosophy. Neither is superior. I think that you get certain things based on your philosophy. Someone like me who's a preparer, you may know what the options are ahead of any issue. But for somebody who is kind of a ride the road type, they may be more mentally prepared for outages because they're just sort of like, oh, okay, well, that's what the road's giving me. Embrace who you are and go with it. I think that I've tried the just kind of wing it approach, which is dismissive, a dismissive way of saying it, a kind of give what the road gives you approach, and it doesn't make me as comfortable. I like preparing. And you know what? I think that if I demanded that a ride what the road type gives you, to sit there and prepare a lot, I don't think that would be very fun for them either. So know who you are and go with that. But just know what the advantages and disadvantages are in that scenario. Number 4, talk to locals. When you are confronted with an outage that you weren't expecting, someone who is local is going to be the best bit of information available to you. Yeah, sure, we've got our smartphones, and yeah, maybe Google Maps will actually be able to give you a detour immediately, but there may be far better options when you talk to somebody than what the map is sort of looking at in the four corners of it. Because a road that looks pretty good may actually be a terrible idea, and a local person is going to know that. You may be surprised at the outcome. You may find that there is actually, say, an off-road trail that exists that does exactly what you need to do, and you didn't even know it existed. You might get an offer for a fast forward or to stay the night at somebody's place while you figure out your way around the outage. Talk to local people and get the information that they've got. They know much better than you can possibly be able to glean off of Google Maps or anything along those lines, especially when you're confronted with something that is unexpected. Last but not least, number 5, keep safe. There may be a temptation to go all YOLO, and I'll have to spell it out for you again. You only live once. That's when you kind of just go out there and you barrel through an outage. You know, that might be okay, or it might be reckless as hell and a real risk to your safety. And then, worse, frankly, that's also reckless and a real risk to the safety of first responders who have to haul your ass out of the situation. Be reasonable, and also remember that outages and detours generally mean you are trespassing if you barrel through them. I am thinking of Highway 1. And I know a bunch of people who actually went through the construction area when they had kind of settled the surface and they were repaving the area. You know what? You were probably trespassing. In fact, they had security there during that. You know what? And if that's your choice, right? But, you know, it's a lot better than the lack of safety when it just goes out and you're just like, screw it, I'm going through it. I remember a story of Big Slackwater before by the way, I keep saying Big Slackwater. This is the section of the C&O where there's large concrete slabs. This was a section which was really the last area that they reconstructed to allow for the full through ride from DC all the way to Cumberland. And it's really only been in a matter of years. It was constructed shortly before I really got into the C&O around maybe 2011, 2012. So, you know, there was a great story of a father and a son who were riding the trail, and they decided to go all YOLO and go right through it before it was reconstructed. And it turned out it was full of poison ivy and there was no bank, and they actually had to end up getting rescued. So they weren't doing a really safe job of things. So be smart. be reasonable, know that there are consequences to your actions, but keep safe. That's the number one thing that I really want to give you on that. So to sum it all up, number one, make sure you got a good attitude. Number two, your ride is the experience, not the map or past routes. Number three, know if you're a preparer or if you're a ride what the road gives you type and go with that. Number four, make sure to ask locals when you're confronted with an unexpected outage or detour that doesn't exist. Hi, Ohio. And number five, make sure that you keep safe. I wanted to, before we closed out the show here, to talk a little bit more about the specific outages, because I know I've already been getting questions from listeners about the C&O, but I also have some thoughts on Highway 1 because I do have a little bit of experience with that area, and I've done a little bit of research on this as well based on past outages. So let's start off with the one that's a little closer to home for me, the C&O Trail. This is really tough. If Whites Ferry is permanently gone and you're not a camper, then I think that I don't have a ton of good things to recommend here. If you are camping, don't worry about it. Nothing. The only thing that you're missing out on is actually kind of a cool experience, which is a bit of a bummer. The cable ferry was really cool. You got this really cool 3.5-minute ride as you're pulled across, and I just really enjoyed it. It would be a bummer if this goes away forever. It's been there for 240 years in some form or another. So it is a bummer, and it's tough for locals because there's, I think, 35 miles worth of river without bridges in either direction. So that's really rough for folks. If you are planning on riding the C&O this year and you were banking on no camping and doing hotels, the problem with that part of the trail is on the Maryland side where the trail is, there are not a lot of options that are nearby compared to what was available or what is available on the Virginia side. That's why lots of people used that cable ferry, frankly, because they were able to get across, and there were some really reasonable and frankly kind of nicest hotels that were available for folks if you took the cable ferry. Not so on the Maryland side. So here's a couple of things that I can offer for you, or just as ideas. Look into shuttles. There are shuttle services that will pick you up anywhere on the trail, and they'll take you to anywhere on the trail or somewhat nearby the trail. If memory serves, there might be in the town that's closest to the Maryland side of Whites Ferry a B&B or maybe even an Airbnb option available. Of course, with COVID, who the heck knows what's going on with that anymore? So do some research and see. I will say you're not terribly far from, I believe, Germantown, which is essentially one of the outer suburbs of Washington, D.C. on the Maryland side of things. There's tons of hotels there by I-270, which is the main highway that comes up through there. Tons of hotels. It's a little too far, and the roads are a little bit gnarly once you get closer to 270 because it gets into full-on suburban assault kind of a thing. But I wouldn't be surprised if the hotels there have shuttles that might be possibly available to you. So you've got C&O shuttles. I know that C&O Bicycles over here in Hancock runs a shuttle. That might be cost prohibitive because they're coming all the way from Hancock and picking you up and whatnot. But if you've got a big group, it might work. It might be possible for you as well. Or some of the local hotels, and I'll say local in air quotes because they're not super close to where you're at. But if you can rock a shuttle, that might be a good possible option for you. A second option for you is rethink your mileage and rethink where you're staying in different days. Because if you can revamp it and make it so that your ride that day actually just goes right through Whites Ferry and you just keep bombing towards Washington, D.C., the closer you get to D.C., the more options are potentially available to you. So consider that as a possibility. And I know that for a lot of you, you're set. You're preparers like me, and you're sort of like, I was really banking on the mileage. My mileage worked really well, and now I'm going to have to mess with what I was going to do the night before and the night after. I get it, but it's something that you may want to start planning for, considering, thinking about now, because options may not be super plentiful this spring or summer, or perhaps even the fall, depending on how things shake out with COVID. One last thing. maybe hope the public pressure can get these Virginia people to accept whatever is going on out of the Maryland side of things. I will say, I wrote that line that's going to appear in the show notes before today's article came out. I mean, today's article makes it seem like that they are at an absolute impasse. For whatever reason, the Virginia people want more money than the Maryland people are willing to offer. And that's kind of a shame. It's kind of cool. If it goes away forever, I'm grateful that I had a chance to cross it a few times, but it's a bummer if you never got a chance to, because it's pretty cool. And here's hoping that maybe they can come to terms. It's just a business arrangement. Dollars, cents, maybe they can figure it out. All right, let's talk a little bit about the Highway 1 situation. So flip the coast. Let's go to the West Coast. The good news. The outage is not as bad as the one that happened, I believe it was a couple of years ago, and CalTrans is on it. They've actually, as I mentioned before, already reopened portions of Highway 1 so that the closures are actually much more narrowly and closer to where the actual outage is, both from the north and from the south. So that's good for the local folks. It still doesn't solve your problem if you're hoping to do the Pacific Coast route and you're trying to get through Big Sur and continue on Highway 1. This will get fixed. It's just a question of when. I would say, based on what I'm reading, and you can check out again that LA Times article, and pay attention to the local papers, both in LA and in kind of the Monterey area. They are the ones that tend to be on top of all of this, and you can see when these things reopen. One thing that I wanted to mention is that I think that the Pacific Coast season is getting narrower and narrower and narrower. It used to be that you could do it anytime between April through mid-fall, late fall even. And that would have been a really wide window for you. Now we're starting to see that large, broad window shrink down. Road closures that tend to happen in the Big Sur area from mudslides during the rainy season, that kind of narrows things down. Sometimes things don't get fixed until much later in the spring than you would reasonably be going. Smoke season, fire season, that's a thing now. It used to be that it was like, oh, okay, well, maybe a few fires would pop up and you hope that it's not anywhere near where you're riding. I'm here to tell you the last few years, and I don't think it's going to get any better. The fire season is creating smoke problems up and down the entire Pacific Coast route. It's not just the Big Sur area. It's in Oregon. It's in California. It's even in Washington State to a little bit more of a limited degree, but it's certainly there as well. That's creating problems as you get late into the summer. So, that window of opportunity shrinks a lot. Now, maybe it's kind of more spotty than anything else, but it's there. Be flexible. Optimize your options. Know your fast forwards. Know the towns with transit options and the ability to ship your bike. Those are all the types of things that you need to be prepared for. And again, if you can't ride every single inch of the Pacific Coast route, it doesn't mean you didn't do it. I rode what I consider the Pacific Coast route back in 2014. But as you all know, I fast forwarded up a certain part of it. Now I made up for it by doing some kind of inland miles in LA County, and I felt like that was good and that counted. And you know what? That was because of the situation by the Marine base. It was just harder to get through there. But that doesn't mean I didn't ride the route. I rode what the route was available to me. So I rode the Pacific Coast route, and you can too. Whether there's closures, detours, whatever, you can absolutely make your ride be the ride that you have available to you. And it's going to be the one that gives you a lot of joy, even if it's maybe not exactly the complete route that you would prefer to ride. Bottom line, our next tours are going to have a lot of energy behind them because we had a lot of our plans in the last year scuttled because of COVID. Remember that outages happen and they are not ruining your trip. They're just throwing a curveball and maybe making it a little more memorable. And as always, we like to close out the show with a special shout out to the Pedal Shift Society. Because of support from listeners like you, Pedal Shift is a weekly bicycle touring podcast with a global community, expanding into live shows and covering new tours. If you like what you hear, you can support the show for $5, $2, or even $1 a month. And there's one-shot and annual options. If you're not into the small monthly thing, check it all out at pedalshift.net/society. On to the society. Kimberly Wilson, Caleb Jenkinson, Cameron Lean, Andrew McGregor, Michael Hart, Keith Nagel, Brock Didis, Thomas Skadow, Marco Lowe, Terrence Manson, Harry Telgadas, Chris Barron, Mark Van Ram, Brad Hipwell, Mr. T, Nathan Poulton, Stephen Dickerson, Vince LaGreco, Cody Florchinger, Tom Beninati, Greg Braithwaite, Sandy Pizzio, Jeff Muster, Seth Pollock, Joseph Quinn, Byron Patterson, Joachim Robber, Ray Jackson, Jeff Fry, Kenny Mikey, Lisa Hart, John Denkler, Steve Henkel, Miguel Quinones, Alejandro Avilas Reyes, Keith Spangler, Greg Towner, Dan Gebhardt, Jody Zeranin, Lucas Barwick, Michael Baker, Brian Bechtal, Reinhard Biggle, Greg Middlemas, Connie Moore, William Gothman, Brian Benton, Joan Churchill, Mike Bender, Rick Weinberg, Billy Crafton, Gary Matushak, Greg Latois Lopez, James Sloan, Jonathan Dillard, John Funk, Tom Bilch, Ronald Piroli, Dave Roll, Brian Hafner, Misha LeBlanc, Ari Messinger, David Grotke, Wally Estrella, Sue Reinert, John Letko, Stephen Granada, Philip Mueller, Robert Lackey, Dominic Carroll, Jackie McCulloch, John Hickman, Jack Smith, Carl Presso, David Neves, Patty Louise, Terry Fitzgerald, Peter Steinmetz, Timothy Fitzpatrick, Dave Fletcher, James Stratakis, David Neves, Mike Lazuski, Hank O'Donnell, David Zanoni, David Weil, Matthew Sponseller, and Scott Angelo, Chad Reno, and thanks to all past and anonymous folks for helping make the show happen. Thank you for joining. You can find Pedal Shift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedal Shift project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono, wherever cool music is available.